You're live.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to New York Symposium with Diane Sare. Diane Sare is a candidate for the United States Senate in New York for 2022. And the purpose of the show is to basically rejuvenate a process and a practice that used to exist in New York City not that long ago. There was a show called Conversations with Channer, for example, a very important show that came on. It was an interview show in which the particular interviewer had many different people from around New York City that would come on and would discuss important topics and sometimes different areas, exotic areas sometimes. This is different. This has the idea of trying to have you think about challenging the axioms of your presumption. That is to say, that in today's world, in which it's become particularly more stratified and more factionalized, many people are operating with the sort of exclusivist position of stating that others don't know what they're talking about. Others are crazy. Other cultures are insane. And what they represent, the way they see things, is the only way to view things, or if not the only way, the best way to view things. And the ability to challenge fundamental presumptions is something that was learned by many who were associated with the economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche. LaRouche was born in New Hampshire, but he spent a lot of time in New York City, particularly in New York City's West Village from 1952 until 1974. He ran for president 8 times in the United States. And he was able, through his various writings and through his organizing activity, to create an organization and sort of a movement in the United States, which insisted on the idea of intellectual integrity above everything else. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to try to explore not only some general themes, but some very specific matters that, of course, confront the United States right now in the aftermath of the presidential election of 2020. But we also want to look at, if you will, the presumptions and the cultural presumptions that have actually impacted and influenced how people even perceive what's going on. And so, to that extent, I want to introduce our speakers for tonight, our discussants, and that's Diane Sare, who've already mentioned. There's also Dave Christie, who's a former congressional candidate from Washington State. And there's Dave DeBroat with the Schiller Institute, of which you'll hear a little later. So we'll go right to Diane and then get everybody else in for the discussion.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Dennis. Well, I wanted to do this on this particular topic because we are really in quite a battle. As people who are watching this program probably know, President Trump has a legal team which is challenging the alleged Biden election victory. And as some of you may know, there are heads of state like Putin of Russia, Lopez Obrador of Mexico, who have refused to congratulate Joe Biden because they say it's really not for the news media to declare the outcome of an election, but there's an official process, and we'll know actually after the Electoral College meets and the legal challenges have been resolved. So, as people may have seen, there was a press conference on Wednesday in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the scene of a very important battle in the so-called Civil War, better called the War of the Rebellion, and the place where Lincoln gave his very famous Gettysburg Address, where a group of Republican state legislators actually held hearings, which were addressed by Rudy Giuliani and addressed by President Trump. And that's one branch of this challenge of the election. And then there are two filings by Sidney Powell on the cases of Michigan and Georgia, which are very extensive and have pages and pages. The filings themselves between the two states constitute about 180 pages. They have accompanying documentation, signed affidavits, etc., of many hundreds of pages, in some cases maybe thousands. And I would say a discussion came up today with one of our friends who does legal translating work in New York, and he said, people say, well, where's the evidence? We don't have to see all the voting machines, although this is one of the things they're demanding, which should be allowed, but signed affidavits of witnesses are evidence. When you have witnesses who have witnessed a crime and they're willing to swear to it under oath that they witnessed a particular thing happening, like thousands of votes coming in and being 98% for Biden or things like that, which are statistically virtually impossible, that is evidence. Now, the question is, how do you really overturn this? Because what we're dealing with, especially in the last years, and this is what we're going to take up tonight, is a mass brainwashing of the American population, the population of Western Europe, by a tiny elite. I mean, it may strike you that all of these so-called major networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, and even Fox News, all seem to have the exact same story. And then you have people from the CIA and the FBI who suddenly are now all anchormen at the major news media stations. So here we say that, the Chinese Communist Party is exercising censorship. Well, I would say we are certainly rivaling, if not surpassing, anything that's being done in China or the former Soviet Union in terms of giving people one narrative. But then you have an additional element of confusion because you have the social media, which we'll be discussing tonight, where people are given their alternative narratives. And the question is, how do you know what is true? To what end are you being manipulated? Is it merely so people can sell you 27 extra pairs of socks? Or is there something else going on that's more nefarious? And I would just like to say a couple things about what's happening in the world. Helga Zepp LaRouche has issued an appeal to stop the Great Reset. On January 23rd in Davos, Switzerland, there will be a conference of all the leading billionaires on the planet. And what they're going for is a global digital currency. They're already talking about digitalized bank accounts for the euro. They're saying that banks will only invest money and offer loans for carbon neutral technologies. So forget fossil fuels. They also are really not supporting nuclear power or fusion research. Basically, you can drop dead. They want depopulation. They think the world has too many people by many, like about 7 billion people should be eliminated, since we're at about, I think, 7.9 billion right now. And what do we have happening in the world, which no one is hearing about? You've had probably somewhat over 7 million people die of starvation this year. 30 million people, largely in Africa, but also places like Yemen, are threatened with imminent starvation. This is something that can easily be addressed. It's not a complicated disease. You need food, and you need transportation corridors that can allow you to get the food to where it's needed. But we also have a crazy scenario which tells us that China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, these are the enemies of the United States. Well, none of these nations has threatened the United States. However, the United Kingdom actually has a document from December 18th, 2018, their House of Lords, saying that the re-election of President Donald Trump would deal the crushing blow to the special relationship between the U.S. and Great Britain. And they say that President Trump must not be allowed to get a second term. They further say that one of the things that they consider the greatest threat that Donald Trump did was to pull the United States out of the Paris Climate Accords, which again is not simply, it's not about climate, it's about halting human progress, and it's also about setting up a financial dictatorship of the central bankers, because if you're not a member of the climate agreement, then an American bank cannot be the head of it or coordinating this thing. So this is, I think, extremely important in way of backdrop. Now, to that end, people may have heard or may not have heard that an Iranian nuclear scientist was assassinated today. This is a terrible thing for scientists or engineers or people working on advancing their nation's technology to lift people out of poverty to be murdered, and for anyone to cheer for such a thing is absolutely criminal. And I don't know how it's being played up or what people watching think of this. But if this kind of thing is treated as if it's normal and people can run around like Barack Obama did, deciding people that they think should be assassinated for arbitrary reasons, then we are really in great danger. And the last thing that I wanted to say is that this can be reversed. What I've seen and others in the last weeks is there's an incredible mobilization of the American people that Trump probably did win in a landslide, got many millions of votes, many more than the non-existent Joe Biden. And happily, the population is not taking it lying down. They're out in the streets, they're mobilized. What's urgent is that the population become informed of the strategic significance of the fight, that this is not a fight that's isolated to the boundaries of the United States, but that the world depends on the United States being a free and sovereign republic, and that our president needs to be able to engage in a dialogue with presidents of other sovereign republics, particularly Russia and China, and also India, to address these problems. Tomorrow, I'll just say, and we'll reiterate it again, at 12 noon at the schillerinstitute.com will be a full discussion and investigation of the voting fraud. But what I wanted to take up tonight and for all of us to think about is how what we think, what we consider to be possible, what we consider to be impossible has been very much manipulated and altered, and much of it in ways that we are not even conscious of. And I think by shining a spotlight on it and becoming conscious of it, we can liberate ourselves not only to be able to act in history, but also to again begin to have a means of determining whether something is true or not. So with that being said, I would like to turn this over to Dave Christie.
Okay, so well, I think what Diane ended with there, I think is a critical aspect of where this battle stands. Obviously, the United States is the ground zero of the fight of whether there are going to continue to be sovereign republics. Certainly, this issue of vote fraud, at very minimum, would completely turn people off to any idea of voting and representative democracy, which is at least the deliberative process of the underpinnings of a republic. But at worst, or what it really represents, is not just simply turning people off of voting. This represents the moves towards dictatorship, and something that's obviously not just been cooked up in the recent last few weeks around the theft of this election, but which has been an ongoing process. And obviously, this question of the Great Reset is the final solution in terms of what they intend with this green genocide. And I think, moreover, the question of viewing this as a global battle, there is no way that without the coordination amongst the leading nations of this planet to bring down the British imperial system forever, that is clearly on the table as a potential, but is absolutely required to have that kind of coordination to bring down the City of London, the offshore banking system, the derivatives constructs, the financial empire, and all of that backed up by the military-industrial complex. Now, I think it's, just in terms of referencing what the discussion today is in terms of this social media, clearly the censorship question has just gone off the rails. And obviously the Hunter Biden thing was certainly the just full onslaught of shutting that down on the mainstream media, but social media, of course, as we saw, that of just not a lot, Twitter just running these massive censorship operations. And then, of course, what we're seeing where you can't even read tweets from President Trump because everything is challenged or it has these little clarification points. So I probably don't need to, convince you that these types of the social media and so forth is running these types of censorship type operations. What I would like to get into is that that's actually the intention of these kind of operations, or largely that's just one feature of what is the intention of the creation of these types of systems, was always about behavior modification, brainwashing, but behavior modification, with the intention of changing the way that people operate. And I think as well, just to reference one point, a colleague of mine, that we began to kind of look at some of these questions again around the issue of social media. As was mentioned earlier, we did put out a report entitled "Is the Devil in Your Laptop?", which actually took up a whole series of different issues, not just social media, but the online gaming or the point and shoot video games, how that plays a role in terms of some of these mass shootings and so forth. But that report was really put out, I believe, I forget the exact date, but 2006, 2007, I believe. And really, this was put out even before social media became the dominant thing. In fact, at that point, they used to have what was called MySpace, which probably people don't even hear about anymore. So, people can refer back to that. But just in terms of reviving, looking at some of these aspects, a colleague of mine cited this Social Dilemma movie that people have seen, or documentary, or however you want to refer to it. Which is funny that it is often presented, or in that movie is presented, as that the intention of this kind of the Facebook, Twitter, etc., social media is simply to profile you, to sell your information. There's a bunch of people that have these sort of targeted focus group types profiles on you, and therefore they can get you the thing that you really want to buy, and it's all about just making money. Similarly, it's you listen to some of these senators who have issues around Section 230 and the censorship operations, which they sort of pose it that this is being done against, conservative groups or so on. All of them, whether it's Lindsey Graham or, Josh Hawley or whoever, who have these problems with them, will always preface it with such an amazing company, and you've just, as a U.S. company that's just a real bringing in billions of dollars revenue and so on and so forth. But that's not the point of these kinds of systems. And the oligarchical networks that have always been behind them have intended them to operate as behavior modification programs. And clearly these programs are obviously being utilized by the NSA and so forth. But the people that developed them, it was much more about the question of group dynamics. So I just want to get to just a couple of historical elements of the development of these technologies, just to kind of give you a sense of what the intention of them were. In the article that I wrote, it was entitled it referred to the International Network of Social Network Analysis. And I referred to it as the headline, or the title of the article, as "Handmaidens for British Colonialism," because that was what people who worked with some of these sociologists, anthropologists, and so on that became part of this network, their colleagues referred to them. And in this case, it was around one of the outfits called the Rhodes Livingston Institute, which would run a kind of profiling operation in Africa, colonial Africa, whether it was for the Dutch, the British, the French, etc. And they would go in and profile how tribal structures work. They would use what's called sociograms, which shows how your connection to people, and they would sort of develop these models called these sociograms, which would enable disruptive aspects to come in and eliminate leadership or target leadership of tribal groupings and so forth, for the purposes of then bringing in the cartels and mining operations of the big cartels to then loot and pillage the nations of Africa. But that was the Rhodes Livingston Institute. Some of the early heirs of that grouping became later part of this international network of social network analysis. But I think I'll just come to another grouping, which I think is significant, which will give you kind of the spectrum of the things that they were involved in. It was called sociometry, and this included a lot of people around the networks around Tavistock and so forth. It included John Dewey, who played a large role in the educational architecture of the United States. George Gallup of Gallup Polls, Frank Stanton of CBS, and then the slew of sociologists and so forth also were involved in the sociometry group. Kurt Lewin, Paul Lazarsfeld, Margaret Mead, others that people associated with works of, or familiar with the works of LaRouche would understand. But this was one of the groups then that ran the Princeton Radio Project, which then would sort of monitor and look at how people reacted to things like the War of the Worlds, which was run out of this. So there's a lot to be said on this aspect, but you can kind of see the nexus point of polling organizations, large scale media, that they wanted to figure out how you could control through the use of media larger and larger groups of people. And all of this was funded by the Rockefellers and so on. So this sociometry group then became later was developed into this international network of social network analysis. But the point on all of this, all these sociologists, anthropologists, et cetera, their motivation was to go after the so-called authoritarian personalities, to then use group dynamics to shift people into democracy. In other words, accepting the sort of the behavior that was determined by these oligarchical networks. So I think that at least just gives a sketch of this, but I think it's important to reference this, that what you're seeing with this kind of censorship is the potential of what Trump represents with his leadership, but moreover, others that are responding to a sense of the ability that we are losing this republic, that you see these kind of operations around social media, trying to shut down the dialogue. But it's not going to be resolved at just simply pointing it out or going after it as the kind of brainwashing operation it is. It ultimately has to be addressed that you can't communicate the kind of ideas that are required now through 140 characters or whatever it is, 280 character limit, and that you actually have to have the more profound discussions about this kind of moment that Shelley identified as in his defense of poetry, that the kind of profound discussions that need to occur right now, that's what people need to be challenged to rise above and get beyond the game theory and the ideas that are presented through these kind of social media. So I think I'll leave it there, because I know Dave DeBroat will take up this kind of larger question of the ability to actually, have real the dialogue of real ideas at this particular critical moment in human history.
Okay, so
Okay.
Dave.
Okay, great. Thanks, Diane, for having me on. So I'm going to look at this book tonight called The Shadows. It's in the shadow. It's written by Nicholas Carr in 2010. And the full title of the book is What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, The Shallows. And he develops many fascinating topics, but I want to just explore one idea that he develops, which is the historical development of different mediums by which we use language to communicate. What role do these mediums play? And so we're going to look, I want to look briefly at three different mediums: the spoken word, oral tradition, print literature, and then the internet. So it's interesting because he asks, what is it doing to our brains? And there are all sorts of interesting studies that have been done to look at what the brain processes that and how they're affected by these different media. But I want to look at that, but then I want to approach it from how I think LaRouche would address this and ask, what is the internet doing to our mind? And I want to look specifically at how the internet is affecting our ability to hypothesize and likewise to make creative discoveries. So to begin with, he starts, 2,000 years ago or so. We're in an era where we're dominated by the spoken word. That's the main form, the main medium by which we communicate with each other. There were books, there were different written forms, but it was much different than the books that we consider today, especially up until about 1000 AD. Authors would dictate books to scribes who would handwrite them. They were intended to be read aloud, and it wasn't until about 1000 AD when they actually formalized the use of space between words. So these books would just be this long, blob of words all next to each other, and specialists would read them out loud who could understand how to do so. So obviously, this was books were fairly rare, and as people started to write books, authors started to write books, the content that they would express changed, obviously, because they weren't dictating to a scribe anymore. They were writing privately, and people began to read as this formal establishment of how to write with spaces and punctuation developed. And people noticed that something different occurred when you read to yourself silently. It was a different experience than having a book read to you. So fast forward, and actually he cites a funny part of St. Augustine's Confessions where they saw Bishop Ambrose reading silently, and it really shocked them. He writes, quote, "When he read, his eyes scanned the page and his heart explored the meaning, but his voice was silent and his tongue was still. Often we came to see him. We found him reading like this in silence, for he never read aloud. He wondered maybe it was because he needed to spare his voice, which quite easily became hoarse." So this was a sort of a new development, reading to yourself silently. Okay, we get to the Renaissance and Gutenberg. Now we have the printing press, and suddenly the characteristics of books drastically change. We have an enormous proliferation of books. They estimate that in the first 50 years, more books were printed in that time period than had been written 2,000 years prior. And we have just obviously a sort of mass experience in the population of people able to read silently to themselves. And there was a real acknowledgement that this was something very different. Nicholas Carr calls it deep reading. And the way it's characterized is which it's characterized by a deep concentration and a certain calm state where your sensory input from the outside world is diminished. So you become completely immersed and very, very focused. Now, books, the development of this new medium was really monumental in our history. And it did come with a lot of controversy. People complained about the proliferation of books. There was, similar to today, people were afraid, people noticed there were just a lot of crap being written, and it was everywhere. People were worried about this phenomenon. So there was a certain conflict between about, is this new medium useful, or is the old medium superior? Okay, so let's fast forward to today, 500 years later, to the 1990s, and suddenly we have another medium emerging. We find ourselves living today in an incredibly, historical moment, similar to what happened with Gutenberg in Gutenberg's time. The internet is, so the internet is definitely very different in its characteristics from the old printed medium, the older medium. It's obviously very useful. Research on the internet is far superior than having to go to a library and dig through the shelves and find books and borrow books from around the country, etc. You could do research at an infinitely faster pace. It's also, as we've seen, incredibly useful for, it creates a capability for people to express themselves much, much easier. It's very easy for people to publish their own writings, to publish their own videos. You don't have to go through a publishing house and get approved and get funding. You can put your works out there very, very easily at very little cost. And then we have the development of social media, which creates an incredible ability to be connected in a certain sense. Now, the internet, though, is different than reading. It's funny. It's similar in the way that it does. We do become immersed in it. We find ourselves completely immersed in it. But unlike reading, we don't find ourselves concentrated on one idea. We actually, despite the fact that we're immersed, we're pulled in 1,000 different directions. Now, this is really the key and a very interesting aspect of this book that he develops, because he looks at what is the effect of this on your brain. And what's been studied and very well developed is that deep reading involves quieting the senses, which allows you to actually go into a deeper, more reflective thought process. You access long-term memory, and you can create associations with it. That's in contrast to what happens when you're distracted. When you're distracted and being pulled in different directions and having to make decisions, you're actually dealing with short-term memory. And unless you can actually free yourself from these distractions, you can't access long-term memory. You can't actually get to this same state that you get to when you read. So Nicholas Carr, I think, and it's very useful that he looks at this from the brain, but we need to think about the deeper significance of this, which is the mind. Now, one could ask, well, what difference does it make? Maybe this relationship to information, to language through the internet is just different. Why? Maybe we don't actually need to spend hours reading books. It takes a long time to read a book. Maybe having information available at our fingertips frees us to do other things, and it saves us the trouble of actually having to commit things to memory. So I think the problem, though, is that if you don't approach this question from the standpoint of what Lyndon LaRouche discovered about the human mind and creativity, you're just going to argue back and forth, and people get really silly about this. Some people say the internet sucks, just stick with books. Some people say the internet's God, I'm never going to touch a book again. that's a really stupid way to look at this issue, because it's not really focusing on their bigger issue, which we need to address. So I want to read this quick quote here by LaRouche from a paper he wrote in 2004, from his paper Earth's Next 50 Years. And so I want to look, yeah, I'm just going to read it and then we can, I think it speaks for itself. Okay, so this is the standard that Mr. LaRouche establishes when you talk about the human mind. He says, by associating an original discovery of a principle with the name of the discoverer, such as Archimedes, for example, we are implicitly obliged to provoke and thus to recreate the relevant cognitive experience within our own mind, an experience which had occurred within the mind of an Archimedes, or the mind of Archytas in solving the task of constructing the doubling of the cube. We thus oblige ourselves to relive the inner cognitive experience of that act of discovery. We seek thus to call into play within our own sovereign mental processes as a living person a replication of the relevant process which occurred in the mind of that living person while he lived. That action by us defines the named discovery as a living idea. And the words used ironically to point in that direction become living words, words with a living meaning for us to replace the dead ones. This is the meaning of the generation and transmission of actual ideas, the meaning of the animation of Platonic forms of ideas. For example, some would commit the blunder of suggesting that discoveries of principle can be demonstrated on the academic blackboard or by a digital computer, as the adult advocates of information theory dogmas propose. The actual discovery is merely prompted by the formal paradoxes, such as algebraic paradoxes, which might be represented on an algebraic academic blackboard. But the act of discovery of a principle occurs neither on the blackboard nor within the bowels of a digital computer. It can be only within the sovereign cognitive processes, the processes of hypothesizing, which are the unique power and the distinction from the beasts of a human mind. So to conclude, I'm arguing that the internet today, as it's organized, is not promoting the type of level of thinking, the possibility of that level of thinking that Mr. LaRouche just outlined. And I believe it's an important role of the LaRouche movement to actually define how to use the internet in such a way that it does promote creativity, and it creates an environment for people to be creative, it's a very unique period of history, I think, that we have to recognize, that's brand new. And if we don't actually define it according to what the human mind needs, then, as Dave outlined, it's not going to be something that is going to be beneficial for our future. So that's what I have.
Okay, well, I guess we should get the discussion going. I'd like to offer one thing for the discussion. You all can hear me, right?
Yeah.
This is from a book called Who Owns the Future? Did you see that? By Jordan Lanier. This is from 2013. Now, the author, Jordan Lanier, is sometimes referred to as one of the co-initiators or co-inventors of virtual reality. But he had this to say: since networking got cheap and computers became enormous, the financial sector has grown fantastically in proportion to the rest of the economy, even though it has done so by by putting the rest of the economy at increased risk. Here's a current example of the challenge we face. At the height of its power, the photography company Kodak employed more than 140,000 people and was worth $28 billion. Kodak, by the way, was largely located up in Rochester, New York, the state in which, of course, Diane is running as a candidate. Kodak even invented the first digital camera, but today Kodak is bankrupt, and the new face of digital photography has become Instagram. When Instagram was sold to Facebook for $1 billion in 2012, it employed only 13 people. Okay, in other words, 140,000 have become 13. Where did all those jobs disappear to? And what happened to the wealth that those middle-class jobs created? This book is built to answer questions like these, which will only become more common as digital networking hollows out every industry from media to medicine to manufacturing. I thought I should just indicate that because what was just brought up in the last presentation by Dave DeBroat is, I think, really important because there are forms of cultural transformation that are deep, not necessarily all bad, but clearly disruptive, and they demand a change of axioms. So I just wanted to add that in, and probably there are responses that Diane or Dave Christie have to what's been said. So Diane, you have anything?
Great. Yeah, I was really struck by actually what Dave Christie said at the beginning on this question of British anthropologists studying relationships among people and group dynamics and trying to figure out how to disrupt that. You can imagine, I mean, think about the role that the FBI played in undermining Martin Luther King and trying to destroy the civil rights movement. Was it merely accidental that the assassination of Martin Luther King left such a void? And what was being played on? You can argue, well, they didn't have social media then, but what was the FBI doing? What kind of messages were they sending? And think about what they have now, which that film, The Social Dilemma, documents, or you think about what Bill Binney has told all of us, that the NSA has every single exchange, every text, every email, and every word we say, because you may notice I have my phone here, my stupid phone, sitting next to me on the desk. If I said, oh, I'm having some lower back pain, the next time I go online, I'm going to have 20 different ads. It'll probably happen now that I said this. I'm going to have 25 different ads for different kinds of this and that to deal with lower back pain. It's there all the time. And those things, that input has an effect on us and how we think. So you may think that your thoughts are your own, and actually they are not. But I think this question of group dynamics is very important, because part of the way they're creating this impression of the nation being divided, I actually don't think the nation is as divided as they say, is they say, well, if you are a Trump supporter, then you have to be against immigration, a misogynist, racist, dumb person who didn't go to college, blah, blah. If you're a liberal, you care about X, Y, and Z. And actually, what you find out when you talk to human beings is that most people actually are concerned about the general welfare. They're actually concerned about the well-being of other people. Most people I've spoken with think it would be a complete travesty to have 30 million people die of starvation right now, that these things actually break down. But the funny thing is, what a show you put to make yourself fit in with the group. You think you have to say these things, and then people say them, but when you get in a one-on-one conversation, you discover no one believes anything that they've been saying. So how does that work? And anyone can say anything about that, but I just think it's extremely striking how much of what we think is our own opinion is absolutely not our own.
Dave Christie?
Well, just on that note, I think this whole question of likes, like and dislike, with the thumb up, thumb down. I was actually struck by it because apparently, in sort of reviewing this sociometry group, which I think is significant, how significant they actually were is not clear to me, but in terms of what the intention was of kind of pulling all these people from media. So sociometry was founded in the late 30s or mid to late 30s, probably the height somewhere in the 40s. But they had, as I mentioned, Gallup from Gallup polls and Frank Stanton of CBS. There was the kind of an intersection around this radio project out of Princeton. But in reviewing that, I was somewhat struck that they actually had I forget what they called it, Little Annie Project. I think is referring to the Little Annie, I don't know the show very well, but where they would literally give people a dial to do a like and dislike during the middle of watching shows, so they could get this kind of real-time assessment of what people were thinking. And that very construct, or just simply that's all your mind is just to say yes or no, or like or dislike, and you're sort of a passive observer, or you're sort of a passive participant in otherwise contributing your thoughts and opinions, and then this will make up the broader perspective of how society operates. That's kind of how these people think. And frankly, it's similar to the whole digital construct anyways, of zeros and ones of how digital systems operate. And the point on all of this is that as a digital system operates, and frankly, as they'd like to have it be for social processes, it's the system has been programmed, and there may be responses to that programming which might change how things come out, but it is the very antithesis of, I think, what at least Dave was getting at, and certainly what Lynn's writings represented, and Lynn's statement there represented, is the actual creation of a new idea does not exist within what was the terms of what was programmed in front of you, or was within the system that you're operating. It's always the poetic idea that comes outside of that and comes as a new discovery. And not to go on, but just the point that Dennis was making, a lot of this, whether it be the rideshare programs, Uber, Lyft, where you're wiping out other industries, but through these so-called efficiencies of being able to use your cell phone to get to somebody that's 5 minutes away from you, give them a ride and all that. They do the same thing with like warehouse space, and it just got a gazillion programs, but it's all to basically cannibalize the existing economy, because the economy is about the stock prices and the values of the system. Or can you use efficiencies within the system, but you're actually not looking at creating new economic advancement, new ideas that will actually get you from a real sense of value to new energy production capabilities, or but all of that requires scientific advancement. But the way these digital systems operate in general is to constrict to what you think is the terms of the game, the rules, what has been programmed. And that is, I think, probably one of the more virulent aspects of this kind of behavior modification and brainwashing, is just to get people into that idea of yes, no, like, dislike. That's not how human beings operate.
Yeah, Dave DeBroda, I don't know if you have a particular response to what you just heard. I have a question for you after you respond, if you have a response. I think you're muted.
Yeah, one thing I realized the last couple of days is that the first iPhone was made in 2007, which really struck me. It's 13 years ago, not very long. And that was the time of the great crash. So all this stuff has developed in the context of a dying imperial system where think about where the money flows come from. What is their interest? What is their intention? So, like Dave was laying out, it's a very, which Nicholas Carr even recognizes, the view of the human mind that these guys have is very, very, as he says, pinched. It's very limited. So they're constructing this whole system according to this idea of the mind they have, which is just not true. And it's creating the world that Dave was pointing out, like dislike, etc. There's no room for hypothesis. There's no room for concentration. But I think it's interesting to think about the context that smartphone, internet has really developed in, and how would it be different if we were living in a productive economy?
Okay, I'd like to get, well, I actually have a particular question for you, but I have a general question for everybody else. I just come first to my particular one for you, and then found something I'd like people to respond to. You referenced that you had first oral tradition, and people basically, it was people speaking, reciting poetry, whatever. And then, of course, you had the printing press come along. That was in 1440, 1450. But in between then, you reference Ambrose, and Ambrose is reading silently, which is sometime around the 4th century. And then, of course, after books really become dominant, which is really only about 500 years ago, more or less, you just said that with, well, of course, the internet can go back to the 1990s, but then clearly when you had the iPhone and certain other things happened, things exploded into a different direction. Now, of course, we see with Amazon and other means that books have this whole question about what the future is of the printed book. There are specials and things all the time. But your point was there are different things that happen with the mind. Well, the brain was what you talked about. And you also said, well, but that doesn't mean that you abandon the internet. So what are your thoughts about what kinds of things people have to think about doing and how, particularly look at education right now? Everybody's, they've shut the schools again. You got kids who are now going to be missing almost 2 years of school, most of whom were born certainly after 2002, 2003. So it's sort of interesting to think about what their relationship would even be to things like printed books, so forth and so on. So just wanted to get whatever thoughts you have about all this.
Yeah, well, we're definitely not going to get rid of the internet. So it's here, but we still have books. We still have the printed literature. So I think, like I said, I really think we have to start from the standpoint, what does the mind need, which is not present today in the schools. I work with high school students and almost nobody reads. And when I find a student that does read, there's something different about the student. One of the hardest things to teach someone, especially when they become in high school, is how to read better. It's extremely, extremely difficult to try to communicate to someone how to read better, or why you understand clearly what the author's saying and why a student can't get it. It's very challenging to think about, well, why do I understand? There's so many processes going on that you've developed over years and years and years. So I think one thing that we have to figure out is how to, we need to figure out how to use the medium to provoke the paradoxes, to present the paradoxes, and then how to resolve them. And I think that the LaRouche Youth Movement was starting to do that a bit when they were working very intimately with Lyndon LaRouche. They were trying to figure out how to create web pages, etc., to walk you through the original discoveries. So I think that's something that we really need to explore, and in general, we have to, if people, somehow we have to get people to read more. I'm not sure how to do that yet, but we need to do that. It's incredibly valuable. Yeah, I'll just say that.
Okay. I understand. I think, Jose, you have a question. Is that right?
Yes, hello, hi, can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay, yes, hi. You won't be able to see me. Don't have my wig on today. Um, Dave, I'm Dave DeBro, excuse me. I'm 22 years old, and I remember that my earliest experience with anything that was digital that involved an interface. I must have been 4 years old or 3 years old, and I vividly remember my father buying me a PlayStation 2. Um, and I was hooked on that. And then I remember going to school, and I was 8 or 9 years old, and I learned how to use a personal computer, a PC. And I learned how to use a keyboard and a mouse and so on and so forth, and learned how to use the internet. And then I got my first iPhone when I was 13. So I actually grew up in this. Now, I think all of you kind of were already, you weren't born into it, so you kind of saw this coming from afar until it hit you. I had to come up growing up with it. And I even remember vividly seeing teachers who were frustrated with this new technology coming up, that's something that was just natural to the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. Even though the teachers couldn't figure it out and they had to, the students actually could. So I find that my behavior, although I would never have realized this if I never found this organization or even listened to Beethoven, is that my behavior, I think, is actually really unhuman. It's kind of weird, but I feel lost if I don't have my phone with me at all times. Most people can't even go to the bathroom without their phones. It's hard to put it down for a few minutes, unless I'm either engaged in reading, but even then I have to take a few minutes to actually concentrate and focus on reading, because the temptation to just open my phone and not do anything, just to unlock it, even though there's nothing going on, affects me. So I actually have to make a concerted effort to really want to read. And the same goes to listening to Beethoven, because classical music, at first I would listen to it passively, but I don't get any enjoyment out of it if I'm listening to it passively. It's something I have to make a big concerted effort to. So I would describe my behavior as almost inhuman or unnatural. And I have to put in extra effort in order to get to do these things that I want to do, by putting away my phone, or maybe turning it off, or putting myself on do not disturb. So how do I deal with that problem while also trying to be somehow creative on the internet, when that same thing, I think, is also what's holding me back? So there's a paradox for you.
I don't really know how to solve that pair. I'm wrestling with that every day. I have no idea. We obviously have to use the internet, but it's extremely distracting. And one of the, going back to what you were asking, Dennis, I mean, one thing that we have to do is we have to figure out how to concentrate when using the internet. Right now, you can't. And, you know, if, for example, Jose, if the internet was modeled more towards giving you an opportunity to concentrate, then there wouldn't be such a huge divide between when you sit down and listen to Beethoven and then when you go and work on the computer. So somehow it has to be reorganized to acknowledge that. But I think it's extremely challenging right now, and it requires what you said. You have to be extremely conscious of your decision to concentrate, and extremely, but you also have to practice it too, which is something he brings up in the book. If you practice this more and more, it actually becomes easier.
Diane, you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, a few things just on the concentration, and I guess I have an advantage being older, not having had this my entire life. But I found even just reading a book, what I would have to do is, one, turn off my phone and put it in another room and make sure that, or at least turn off the ringer. Two, you're so accustomed, if you use your phone a lot, if you're checking your email a lot, that when you sit down, your mind races. So I actually developed an exercise where it's not an exercise, but I have a scrap of paper and a pen with me. And when things pop into my mind, oh, I forgot to do this. Oh, I didn't do that. Just extraneous noise. I just write it on the piece of paper and put it aside and say, I'll think about that later. And it usually takes 45 minutes of all of these leftover things to get out of my mind before I can actually concentrate. I was thinking, though, about this means of communication, and I don't know, I can see Raz is impatient with Dennis there, but is it possible for people to stay on a little longer? Because I think this topic is really important, and we've gone to our hour. Is that all right, Dave Christie? Are you okay? A little bit longer? All right. Just because one of the things is the way people communicate. Like people communicate, particularly younger people communicate by text. People don't talk to each other. So one, there's no form of irony, because if I'm talking to someone and they make a suggestion that I think is absurd, or maybe they say something that I think I really should do and I don't want to do it, and I'll say, go F yourself. And there's an irony in it, because I'm not saying that because I hate them. I'm saying it because I'm laughing at myself, because I know it's something I should do. And I'm kind of making fun of myself and that person. Now, can you put that in a text? Like, you could write the words literally, in which place the person would freak out and think you were enraged. Or you write the text and then you put an emoji of someone winking, which still, there's no way you can actually convey in a text message with emojis the same idea that you would convey if you were talking to someone face to face in person. That's one thing that's really very destructive. And the other aspect of that is that people do this thing called ghosting, right? Where people are trying to reach you and you just don't respond at all, which is really bizarre. And it's very asocial, so that people don't have a relationship with something that's real. They have a stronger relationship with something that is imaginary. And the other aspect of this is, of course, people may know I was sort of not surprised, but it was shocking, the statistics on the increase in suicides. I think they were looking at among young girls. The ones, I forget the age range, 19 to 24 were up by something like 60 or 80%. And then younger, 14 to 19-year-olds or something, were up by 123%. A massive increase of suicides among young people, because your so-called peer group is mediated through this social media and this fitting into a group, which you can't ever come up to, because everybody is using all these gadgets and, you know, Photoshop and this and that to change their appearance. And then you look at yourself in the mirror and you're not what your friend is on their Facebook or Instagram or whatever, Snapchat or whatever, picture or video. So these things are really destructive, and we have very peculiar relationships among human beings, I have to say.
Dave, Christy, any thoughts?
Well, I mean, other than just to buttress that point, just all kinds of strange things where, you know, kids are even just opting out of, you know, sexual relations as well, because of what Diane just mentioned, the idea that, you know, there's such like a pristine image that you want to be presented, or that you want to present through your Instagram accounts or whatever, you know, whether your various social media, that that there's this reluctance amongst younger kids to be involved in or young adults, whatever, to be involved in the messier aspects of just human relations. And so, I mean, these are, real from a sociological standpoint. And of course, the implications of that are fairly huge, let alone just the implications of just an actual relationship based on real ideas, which is clearly being eroded as well. I mean, the same thing that goes for, I guess there's a kind of a general sentiment that even things like punctuation in texts are somehow seen as kind of too much of an assertion, and therefore you can't even use punctuation, let alone the grammar and the spelling and everything else that's fallen by the wayside. So I mean, so again, I think it's back to the point that Dave was saying. Everything is a kind of a dual technology or a double-edged sword. I mean, it can be clearly these technologies could and should be used for the benefit. They were clearly developed not for promoting human advancement or the facilitation of ideas. But I think it's just part of an overall cultural question that we are, I'd say we have been in a dark age. How advanced that dark age could become, I think we all know it can get far worse, but it is going to be resolved ultimately by a new renaissance for humanity. And then I think some of these other questions of how to actually use these technologies, we can address them there, but it's at least useful to just point out the limitations that are imposed by these structures just on their own and what that's actually done to people.
Well, I think the one thing I'd like to say about all of this is that there's real hope in what Dave DeBroat read, the reference from Leonard LaRouche concerning this idea of ideas as life, and that ideas have a name, and that individuals are associated with ideas. There's this notion which is taken up by Edgar Poe, the poet. It's taken up also, of course, in John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word. And this notion of the power of words, where the notion is that there's a power, and Diane referenced it, that there are things you can't text, or your things you cannot write also. There are also things you can't state. There are some things that you can sing that you can't state, for example. You can put some things into musical language that you can't otherwise express. So one thing that's interesting, I think, is that there are ways to show people that there's a world beyond whatever the literal is, the literal world, the visual world, or the world of the senses. And when you do that, it's shockingly pleasing. Everybody knows, for example, if you're telling a joke and you are saying something which isn't what you're saying, and everybody knows it, which, there are many different ways to do that. So there's a pleasure in the mind because the mind is able to see that you're saying something that you actually aren't literally saying. So you're saying the opposite of what you seem to be saying. And so there's a lot of ways in which that becomes the humor, actually, often. That's what happened, in fact, in the Dark Age. That's exactly how we got out of the Dark Age in Italy and in Europe in the 14th century, because that the poet Petrarca was having a conversation with Boccaccio, his friend. And he said, look, if you can't get people to laugh, they're going to die. The whole civilization will die. We have to get them to respond somehow. And the Decameron was written. And remember, the Decameron setting is the plague. It's actually set outside of the city of Florence, where everybody is dying, or many large numbers of people are dying. And these people have gone off to the hills to tell stories. And the stories are not all funny, but the stories are ways of trying to take a look at what the real process is that got them there. How did they get to that point? So I think that, and it's interesting also in terms of defeating, and that's something you can do, where you are able to tell jokes, whether that's via the internet or via words or via print, or all sorts of other ways. You can do jokes visually too. What's important, I think, is to have the idea that you are trying to get to the invisible. And I think we already all we're talking about that. That's a lot of what you, Dave DeBroat, were referencing in what you said, even in the comparisons of the oral tradition to then the printed word, to then how internet is not the same thing as reading. I mean, even you're saying that people think they're reading all the time. They're reading the words, feels like it's reading, but you said, no, actually, that's not the same thing at all. So I think there's an interesting area here where there's a new, in fact, it may be precisely because of the COVID pandemic. I mean, a lot more people are reading or getting on and reciting things like Shakespeare dramas. You just get on to talk or to tell a story. I mean, it's interesting. You can use the internet to connect to a whole bunch of people on a Zoom platform and have them all do a Shakespeare play or some other play. So maybe there are ways to address this where you can almost turn the thing around or turn it on its head. So I think that's an interesting way for us to think about it all. Diane, what do you want to do? You want to continue? You want to?
We should probably wrap up, but I see something that's come in from the YouTube that Jenny put in the notes here about what are our ideas about grammar, spelling, in public libraries. Someone wrote, most sovereign minds that I grew up with had no television. They read. We need to keep financing libraries. Very exciting to research in a library environment, someone writes. And then someone else says, we need Cusa's writings in Spanish. So yeah, maybe we should wrap up. I mean, I think what I would like to say is that this question of truth, because that has to do, I think that gets us back to this assault on the quote unquote authoritarian personality. And again, on this movie, The Social Dilemma, they make a point that everything is these algorithms. So they are trying to make you spend the maximum amount of time online, and they measure exactly how many seconds or fractions of a second you look at a particular image. And therefore, when you go to something, they profile you and they feed you all these things that either fit your worldview or don't quite fit it. Because I think the point is what Lanier said, which is they want to change their behavior, modifying you. So they suck you down what they call a rabbit hole. And by appealing to something you think you agree with and then slightly twisting it, I guess it's like getting your teeth straightened or something. But take this election that we've just had. The perception that's been created by the so-called mainstream, the lamestream fake media, is that Joe Biden won. He's the president-elect. Whatever Trump says is the fringe, etc. Now, happily, the media has been so thoroughly self-discredited that a lot of people don't believe that, but a large number of millions of people do. So how would you handle in this country if you have massive vote fraud? Can you just say Trump won? Or do you have to, and how would you demonstrate to the population that Biden did not win the election? And how do you appeal to someone's sense of reason? And I think this is why, again, what Dave DeBroat was saying about Lyndon LaRouche's work with the youth movement after 2000, 2001, where I think he really wanted to emphasize the question is not what you think, but how to think. And the importance of reading the dialogues of Plato and Socrates, that you have trust, you have faith in the human mind, that it's not a blank slate, that there's a certain resonance with universal principles, and that through the power of reason, you can actually determine whether something is true or not. And in a real sense, I think this is very, very much what we are fighting for today.
Dave Christie?
Well, just briefly, I do think that just the problem that Diane identified, I mean, on this whole so-called election, of course, we know it was really just a continuation of the coup against Trump, and clearly what he potentially represents in terms of going with other leaders, but also our LaRouche's ideas and so on. That's a very real threat to the oligarchy. But this whole idea of the narrative, the whole point of this group dynamic stuff is that they knew that what you thought other people thought and how that informed your decision making and so on, that was far more effective than sort of individual coercion tactics in terms of the behavior modification is. And so it's a real question right now because we're dealing with issues of there are principles in our Constitution, there are protocols, there are things that Hamilton set up, even around the Electoral College and how the Federalist Papers 68 on how to actually deal with these things, and whether or not people have the courage to go to principle rather than to accept the narrative, to accept what everybody is supposed to be thinking, that these are all conspiracy theories that Trump is throwing out there. So the way that they have done this is also to undermine principle in general, but also principle in statecraft. And that is certainly a very real challenge at this particular moment. And it is going to require courage of individuals, whether they be in the courts, whether they be in the state legislatures, whether they be, and of course, the American people as citizens themselves. And so I think just to have a sense that all this group dynamics, that's what it's designed to do, is to get people to think that you just have to go along with, what everything else is, rather than recognizing that there is principle. There are reasons why the principles have been developed by sovereign individuals, and it is going to be the sovereign individuals and the courageous people. Mr. LaRouche certainly emphatically was that, but that's what's going to change history at this moment.
Dave, how about you? DeBroat.
Yeah, well, what Dave just pointed out, that's what I was thinking about. Is it really is, and what we've been discussing, it's not going to be a matter of tallying votes and all this stuff that we need to make a breakthrough against the vote fraud. We need leadership. We need people that are capable of thinking as individuals and acting according to what they know is true. And that's what's going to change the dynamic right now. It's that act of leadership. So that's all I have to say.
Okay, a couple of things in the way of news items we just want to report to people. There's now been as of this evening, a joint resolution in Pennsylvania introduced to award Pennsylvania's electoral votes to Donald Trump. This has been introduced in the State House and Senate by Senator Mastroianno. So that's been reported as about an hour ago. That's one development. Another interesting development for those who might follow things like this is to know that there's been a change in the Defense Policy Board. This is a body of usually senior thinkers that are supposed to be involved in American foreign policy. And it says the Department of Defense has removed several members of its Defense Policy Board, including 2 former secretaries of state and a former House Majority Leader. That the people removed are Henry Kissinger, Madeleine Albright, Eric Cantor, David McCormick, and others. There are 11 notables, as they say, that have been suddenly asked to leave that body. And an official said, as part of long considered changes, we can confirm that several members of the department's Defense Policy Board have been removed. I am grateful to the departing board members, many of whom have served for decades. As we adopt the Department for Great Power competition, I look forward to naming new board members in the coming days. Now, we don't know whether the new people named will be as bad as the people leaving, but we certainly can say some of the people leaving, it's good news. So as people know who can't get on the show, we started by saying that Diane is a candidate against Chuck Schumer, who United States senator, has been there forever, and who became famous for his statement that the intelligence agencies can get you 6 ways to Sunday if you try to clean them out, which is the thing that Donald Trump had announced 2 days into his 2017 presidency. January 22nd or 23rd, he made that announcement. And I think let's also point out that Mastriano, who introduced this resolution, had his Twitter account shut down. There's Donald Trump, who of course had been kicked off for a while, and there's several people, including some people even around the present vicinity, who've had some problems like that. So maybe the people being censored are suddenly getting their day. We'll see. But I thought we should at least call attention to that. I guess the only other thing I just wanted to say, because Diane, you may want to have a couple very last words here, is that on what was asked about on the question of libraries and things like that, and having great books that people read. I think the thing to do is to engage in the dialogue process. I think it's something that's going on here. That's what this symposium's for. That's what we said. The whole point of the show is to have people from the New York area, or for that matter, from around the country, but concentrating on the New York area, that the people from New York get involved in this dialogue. This is something that used to exist in New York City. It was very widely practiced, and it was something that Lyndon LaRouche himself was very involved in the 1950s, when he was making certain breakthroughs in physics and economy, particularly in the period of 1952. He often had a lot of conversations with people who were the original inventors of television. Television had been on for a while. In 1939, of course, it had been invented, but LaRouche was actually involved with a lot of the people that were doing live TV back in those days, the Omnibus program and some of the other things that were live. And there was a big discussion about exactly the kind of things we're talking about, how to use that medium for productive and not just educational purposes, but actually what would constitute real drama. Rod Serling, for example, who later became very famous around the Twilight Zone, he was of the view that he went to television because he could do nothing on radio of any significance. He said it was terrible, it was awful. He was hoping to do something on television, and then it turned into the same thing. It's interesting for us that we're talking about something that's been a great debate in different forms in America for a long time. But coming back to this issue of ideas, and this idea of how to change people with ideas, Diane, I figure why don't we give you the chance to say something about your campaign and the way in which you see that goal reflected in your own work.
Well, I would say the point of this campaign is not to be popular or to quote unquote get votes. Lyndon LaRouche always said never to do that. The point is we have to win the war. We have to win the policy, and the population needs leadership. It's interesting. A courageous leader can liberate people from the shackles of popular opinion. That's what Lyndon LaRouche did his entire life. That's why he was such a threat. You saw that also with great presidents like Franklin Roosevelt. People in his administration did remarkable things under Franklin Roosevelt's leadership, things that they would not have been capable of but for his courage and what he was doing. And I believe, especially what you're seeing in Pennsylvania with this resolution to have the state choose the Trump electors coming from the legislature, is indicative. What President Trump did in the allowed, people remember the Kavanaugh hearings. Now, had Trump not been president and waging the kind of fight he was waging, there's no way that Kavanaugh would have made it into the Supreme Court. That would have just been dropped. And I think it's we have a mission for mankind. China, I had meant to say earlier, China has now met their objective. They have no more extreme poverty in China. They have poverty, but not extreme poverty. The last 9 counties have been elevated out of extreme poverty, and they did things that the liberal environmentalists would consider absolutely dreadful. They moved people. They said the first thing was you had to have a government that people trusted, and that people had to be responsive to the government. The second thing is they said areas which had just become total deserts or unlivable, unworkable, they had an aggressive program to relocate people to areas where they could be more productive. And they said now they want to move on to water management, healthcare, certain other things. Think about this. Americans can barely imagine this. And by the way, the State Department just published a whole paper which reveals that they didn't want Americans to get seduced by the optimism of China. So the State Department has had a policy of bludgeoning people into pessimism about the evil Chinese Communist Party, which is not even communist in the way people would think about it here, or what they think. It's more Confucian. So in terms of the candidacy, the idea is we need a movement. New York is critical to the nation. The city of New York, Manhattan, was where George Washington was inaugurated. It's where Alexander Hamilton was working on the Federalist Papers, was creating in his mind an economic system that would pull the nation together. Lyndon LaRouche would never allow the destruction of the city that is happening right now. It is not the same as any other city in this nation. And if New York City is allowed to be destroyed, then I'm afraid we are not going to save the republic. So I think these things are very related. My campaign, the state of New York, what happens in the nation, and then the role that the United States plays in the world are critical. And finally, I would just really urge people to tune in at 12 noon tomorrow at the schillerinstitute.com, because the investigation of the voter fraud in the United States is going to be run by an international panel. And Dennis Speed, since you're quite involved in this, you may want to say more about why people should be on that. But I think it's crucial that people join us for that tomorrow at noon.
Okay, well, I guess I'll just say a little bit about that. It's called the International Commission for the Investigation of Truth in the Elections. And it's intended to be an inquiry into the entire process, because there are also some matters of very great importance to other nations. Of course, the United States election, what happens in the United States affects every other nation in the world. And it will go on for about a 3-hour period. It will have a group of people that will basically be hearing reports from 3 individuals, the first of whom will be William Binney, 36 years employed by the National Security Agency and a whistleblower at that agency, who will be talking about the way in which potentials within the intelligence establishment may have been used in the elections to alter the outcome of the elections. Harley Schlanger, who is a spokesman for Lyndon LaRouche and who has also done it, he does daily reports, which are seen in various places, will also be giving a report, kind of a comprehensive report on what has actually been being presented in the various locations in the way of evidence. And then Colonel Richard Black, who became very well known throughout social media because of his warning about a potential military coup against the presidency. And over 600,000 people, I think, have seen his short presentation to that effect. So that'll be what will be happening tomorrow. What will happen is that the panel will hear the reports and will question each of the rapporteurs, and then it will be opened up for additional questions. And so everybody's welcome to join us. That will be at the Schiller Institute site, schillerinstitute.org, and you can check us out there. So I think And then there will be, I should say, a conference that will be happening a couple of weeks later, which you can hear more about from us. Schiller Institute will be doing that. That will be on December 12th and 13th. But these are things that you can find out more about tomorrow if you are watching at that time. So I guess it was probably time for us to wrap up. So I'd want to thank Dave Christie, Dave DeBroat, and of course, Diane Sare for the conversation and the discussion tonight. I want to thank everybody for watching this episode of New York Symposium with Diane Sare.